Welcome to NeuroNoodle's Neurofeedback and Neuropsychology podcast featuring tech legend Jay Gunkelman. He's the man who has read well over 500,000 brain scans, and Dr. Marie Swingle, author of iMinds. Our goal is to provide information and promote options for better mental health. The NeuroNoodle podcast is supported by listeners and businesses just like you.
You talked about Brett Favre yesterday.
Yeah.
And you know, he in a hearing where he's trying to waive off liability for money that was perhaps stuck away in a way that it might not have really been appropriate, but he was trying to set up some sports thing, and who knows? But that aside,
Something shady was going on.
He shared that he was now diagnosed, but it's actually goes back a few years to his first symptoms, where he was having difficulty with the movement in his right hand, and found his arm to be essentially not really under his full control, and so he ended up going through diagnosis. But they essentially suggested that this was likely associated with his head trauma. Now, Parkinsonism is a dopamine problem in the striatum, the basal forebrain nuclei, specifically the substantia nigra, but you can end up with damage in the forebrain. Let's say he had head injuries, and he admitted to saying, well, he had maybe 4 or 5 significant head injuries. Well, how about all those insignificant, maybe 100 or so of those? He had 20 years of being wrapped around. I mean, and that, let's not count too many of them, but 4 or 5, come on, so he had some significant head injuries. Look at the statistical average of being wrapped around in the head. Where does the brain get damaged when you end up having head injuries in general? The basal forebrain, the lateral frontal areas, and the anterior temporal areas. Those are the most likely. Now, you can get damage almost anywhere, but when you look at where do people find damage, that's the most likely. Well, that orbital frontal is going to end up being something that damages the dopaminergic systems in the basal forebrain, the striatum. And those nuclear bodies end up controlling attention. The ADD kid who's got a dopamine deficit that needs his methylphenidate, well, what do they give? They don't give methylphenidate for Parkinsonism, but they give dopamine supplementation, levodopa, carbidopa. There's a whole regimen of it, but you become less and less and less responsive to it over time. So it's not like there's a real fix with the medication. And before you present with your first symptom of a tremor of some sort, you've got 75% of the cells in the substantia nigra already damaged. There's a lot of this isn't a subtle thing. It's fairly advanced by the time you see the behavioral manifestation. Now, it's not always from trauma. Dementia pugilistica, the boxer's brain giving a Parkinson's-like problem, is well known. That's classic. This is absolutely classic. I mean, when it's got a Greek freaking medical name, that's classic, So, but you can also get it from toxic exposure. And the CDC has identified areas in the country, regions, specific locations where the Parkinsonism is a hot spot. And the some of the commonalities, in fact, one of the most strong correlations there is with TCE, which was at one point used as a solvent in electronic industry production, but and dry cleaning, and it's a
Hmm.
solvent. So yeah, very very toxic stuff. And again, unfortunately, also it has a tendency uh, to end up being fat soluble or fat stored. So you kind of accumulate it with exposure. Anyway,
With
um,
Brett Favre, Jay, you mentioned the Rich Club hub. Like, how many hubs are there? Are those the different points that you were mentioning? In
yeah. Well, there's different networks, and the networks have connections between hubs, and the hubs that are important frontally. The anterior cingulate is one of the more prominent hubs. The insulae on both sides are hubs, and the insula is the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe kind of cover over a piece of cortex. If you peel back the frontal lobe operculum and you open up the temporal lobe, you actually see cortex there. Well, that's insula or insulated or covered over cortex, and that cortex ends up being a major hub in the salience network. It also, in the anterior aspect of it, in the posterior aspect of the insula, you end up having all interoception and peristalsis, the propulsion, speeding it up or stopping it. Uh, Discharges there can cause spasms in the intestinal tract, which are called abdominal epilepsy. Historically, it's an archaic term in neurology that's not part of the international classification system, but you can go online and find articles about intestinal spasms causing pain due to epileptiform discharges in the insula. It's the posterior insula for that. So, those are part of the salience network frontally. The anterior cingulate's also a piece of the default mode network, but the default mode network has the posterior cingulate, the temporoparietal junction on either side, and the anterior cingulate as hubs within that network with spokes in between them. The PZ for the default mode and the AFZ or FZ for the salience network end up being the rich club hubs of those two networks. The other hubs are major hubs, and they connect as well. As an example, the anterior cingulate and insula connect to the amygdala, which is an important thing with respect to affect and emotional processing, and also affective gating. On there's a specific test called a go no go stop task. It's an event related potential where they present stimuli, and some stimuli you're not supposed to respond to. That's a no go, and some you're supposed to respond to. That's a go. But some of the ones when you respond, you'll be flagged after you start responding to stop. And when the stop happens, if you look at that with functional MRI, differentiating it from other states, and admittedly, this is a functional MRI study, and a lot of people will kind of turn their nose up at that because of the dead salmon problem. But nevertheless, they've identified the amygdala, the anterior insula, and the operculum. That is the emergency stop network, and That corresponds nicely with the attribution of F8, or the right lateral frontal area, being involved in affective gating and impulse control. So it matches up with the expected topographic surface
Well, you
function.
gave Tua some advice last week regarding his concussions. What advice would you give to Brett Favre in dealing with his Parkinsonisms after he gets done with his money legal issues?
Well, he's got a few years of being able to manage it with meds, um, that's it's a relatively effective initial treatment. But there's going to be a point in time when he sees that that's starting to fail. And at that point, there's going to end up being the possibility of an implant, a stimulator that can be turned on and off. The stimulator will be implanted in the chest wall, and the wiring that basically goes up and stimulates the subthalamus, and that turns off the tremors in the the circuitry that normally would rely on dopamine to get a kick in the circuit has got a zap in the circuit now. So it just stops the problem, and those work really quite well. I had a friend in the little town of Crockett, and I knew him fairly well. Coffee shop, sort of a friendship, knew him by name, and you'd see him. He liked to jog, and he was a runner up in the hills around the town. And eventually, I saw him kind of only walking, and then I saw him shuffling, and I asked him what's going on, and he said, "Well, he's got Parkinsonism," and then he started to fall, which is when you want to take a step forward, and you kind of lean, but you can't move your foot. You can't initiate the movement,
Mhm.
which Brett Favre was having trouble initiating movement with his right hand at this point. Well, at that point, he would fall. So he asked me about the implants. He was considering it, but he was really terrified of it, brain surgery. And I explained to him that's actually pretty, it's stereotactic. It's not like they open you wide up and dig around in the brain. And this isn't the get me the AB normal brain from over there. We'll just put it back in or something. The it's a stereotactic implant to a specific location, and they'll get your head all solid and get it to the right spot. So when you turn it on, it stops the tremor, and you'll be actually there, and they'll turn it on and off, and you'll demonstrate it right there. Uh, you don't have to be unconscious to have the implant stuck in. So
So neurofeedback doesn't it helps the medicine work
uh,
better?
neurofeedback can end up facilitating the length of time that you can still have some volitional control. Remember, the percentage of the cells that have to be dysfunctional before you start to show a symptom. Well, all you have to do is change the function of a small percentage of them, and you can become asymptomatic or less symptomatic. And the training of SMR, which is a stabilizing rhythm in the brain, ends up being something that has been shown to help with tremor, and not just Parkinson tremor, but also essential tremor. Uh, uh, there's post-traumatic disturbances where it causes a tremor just directly because of a damage to a nuclear body in the forebrain. And yeah, the training of SMR ends up helping neurocognitively as well. It's not just um, for the tremor. The SMR training ends up helping perceptually. The University in Salzburg, the consciousness and sleep lab there, uh, uh, did SMR training, and they did visual event related potential testing. And with the SMR training, it decreased somatosensory interference with the visual processing. So it ended up kind of clearing the perception. Anyway, it's not a bad side effect. It helps with sleep, um, but it's stabilizing and inhibiting. And you can't drive a car just standing on the brakes, you know. So SMR training can become hyperstable and excessively stable, ends up being not what you end up wanting as well. Uh, Becky Basham has worked with some pro football players, and there's beta spindles at CZ. They have trouble with sleep, and if you're not sleeping, you're not getting slow wave sleep, so you're not getting growth hormone, so you're going to have trouble, with breakdowns and wearing out, and the quality of your sleep ends up allowing you to remember what the coach taught you even. So, sleep's important. So the beta spindles have been trained down and SMR is trained up, and they now sleep well, but they feel like they lost their drive. So she has to train back their beta. After they've learned how to sleep, she teaches them how to control their beta and make it return. So that it's not like they can't then turn it down and leave the SMR on to sleep, but they return their drive. So you can't just do SMR training and expect everything to be perfect. Now, a lot of people need a lot of inhibitory training, but there's going to be a point where you need to tap on the gas. And as I tell people, my grandmother did drive the car with the foot on the brakes and the gas at the same time. It squeaked like hell. Every gas station waved at her, expecting her to pull in at any moment for a brake job. But excite and inhibit have to balance. And when protocols are designed, you've got to make sure that there's a proper balance being assigned. That if you just do excitation, and some people need a lot of excitation, that they would need a stimulant basically. So excitation would be the thing, and for them, you excite to a point, and at that point you need stabilization to counterbalance it. So the classic work early on with Lubar, who unfortunately has passed recently. It was CZ for SMR and FZ for beta, and those two balanced out. And for the Alzheimer's, it was C3 beta and C4 SMR, and then C3 FZ beta, C4 PZ SMR. And they branched out from there, and infralow has been added on.
The tremors, is it always the same arm? And if you're left-handed or right-handed, does it make a difference, or just that part of the brain that's affected? I always wondered
It's just the part of the brain that's been affected.
Okay.
He probably has orbital left frontal damage more, which is causing the basal ganglia and motor regulatory for the right hand is the left side of the brain. So somebody was coming in who was right-handed and whapped him up the left side of the head a few times.
He needed a better left tackle.
He was cocked back, and he was blindsided. I don't know. You can hypothesize, but at some point there are brain banks that receive donations, and they say a third of the retired pros think that they've got CTE just as their subjective guess. Probably a reasonably good guess.
If you saw Brett Favre's EEG, you knew he was 58 and you knew he was a male. What would you pick up on his EEG, you think?
Well, given the fact that I know that he's got a symptom of a right hand Parkinson's problem,
Yeah.
I would expect to see a thalamocortical dysrhythmia coming out of the left frontal area. And the premotor and motor strip is where you see the thalamocortical dysrhythmia for movement disorders.
Right.
And that, the machine learning algorithm has been able to identify the dysrhythmia, and where it's located determines what symptom it is. If it's in the auditory cortex, you have tinnitus. If it's in the somatosensory cortex, you have pain. If it's in the motor or premotor, you have movement issues. And if it's in the anterior cingulate, you have the reward deficiency, including depression and obsession and addiction and eating disorders, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the reason we're talking about Brett Favre, he's in the news, plus it also was talked about on our weekly chat with our panel, the NeuroNoodle Q&A, every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Central Time. A lot of regulars are stopping by asking questions. That came up. And Jay, what's
So you got to imagine his EEG. So you normally have background alpha rhythm, and he's a sharp enough guy. I expected his alpha to be normal, if not slightly fast, perhaps. Higher performers quite often have a slightly faster alpha. It's a little faster, higher sampling rate, a little bit of resolution. So let's say you had a normal alpha at 10, and it's in the back of the head as a big alpha at the back, but you have some alpha frontotemporally. And in an area that's got ischemia and post-traumatic ischemia, the concussion causes swelling, causing compression of the blood vessel, causing ischemia, which is less oxygen and glucose downstream, kind of a kink in the hose. So you expect the alpha in that area to end up slowing acutely, but when you have chronic traumatic encephalopathy, it's no longer a temporary ischemia. You've got a, a, a relatively permanent change in vascular capacity in that area, and you get tropic changes. And tropic changes. What's that? You get a palm tree or something? uh, you know, uh, no, it's atrophy, and the density of the tissue ends up decreasing. If you've looked at the CTE versus normal brains, they're less puffy. They're darker because you end up don't have uh, uh, the healthy tissue. You've got necrotic changes. Anyway, it's a brain shriveling uh, 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 like a walnut. So
oh, ugh. Jay, what's going on? Anybody got a birthday next month? Something happening?
there's a rumor that there's this Suisun Summit next month, from the 9th to the 12th in Suisun City. That's suisunsummit.com. And that's Suisun, Suisun, which means west wind. And it's here in town because I can't travel. And we've got Yuri Kropotov doing a keynote. Uh, we've got Antonio Martins-Moro over from London Scientific. Santiago will be over here from Singapore. We've got a mixture of male and female presenters all lined up in the document on the front. And if you start on the far right with Yuri, it's male, female, all the way across until you get to me. Apparently, I'm being reassigned. So, but it's got specific topical discussions on biomarkers and phenotypes. It's got medication prediction discussions. It has a detailed discussion about the insula and how to see it in the EEG, and clinical case study series from a neuropsychological practice that has an interesting referral pattern now, having gastroenterologists referring people in for testing. So anyway, I expect also to have a birthday party mixed in there, and one night they're doing some karaoke. I mean, how do you stretch a birthday party into 3 days and have an EG meeting run through it? It has a full service bar, and the events are being live streamed in the bar for those that don't
Very
make it
full
into the
service. Yep.
event. But if you can't make it to the event itself, you can pick it up as a live stream and get the recording. But it's got a lot of really good material. You can go online and look at the abstracts of each of the presenters and get a little idea of some of the content.
We'll put all the information in the show notes.
And for those that attend, there's, for the speakers, in cobalt blue with gold lettering, 2024 Suisun Summit is handed out to the speakers, but I got 20 of them, and there aren't that many speakers. So in the raffle there'll be a number of those, as well as they've got some bobbleheads that they've got with more gray in the beard now, and they got a bunch of eye patches, and the raffle will have all sorts of weird memorabilia. And their logo is a beard and an eye patch. And anyway,
as it should be.
It's it's intended to be good neuroscience and fun, and I can't create that at a meeting planning it somewhere else, and now there's a group that plans it here, so I just have to pop in.
Absolutely. Jay Gunkelman, great show, great ISNR show, all the people in Chicago, hey, and travel safely, everybody. Jay, see you next Wednesday, 6 p.m. Central.
Hope to be there.
All right, bye-bye.
The NeuroNoodle podcast is supported by listeners and businesses just like you.